If you've played games in recent years, then you've probably asked yourself this question. Why do so many games run so poorly, and why do so many of them use Unreal Engine? If you understand something about game engines, you likely already know the answer. But before I start, I should probably do a brief introduction. My name is Soliloquist. I'm a solo game dev closing in on 40 years of age, and I've been doing game dev since 2001. In the years between 2001 and 2020, my game dev efforts were mostly an on-again, off-again hobby. I finally decided to get serious about my hobby sometime in September 2020. Most of my early work has been lost to the sands of time, or family members who deleted it from the family computer because they saw no value in it. I've worked with generative AI since 2018 when most people shrugged their shoulders at it, thinking it would never amount to anything. I've worked on software for the Air Force, and I've launched 2 games on Steam. One currently in what I call curation mode, and the other just went into early access. It is my opinion that the reason we're facing an epidemic of poorly performing games is the result of Epic Games having created, marketed, and made accessible a game engine to people who don't understand the underlying principles of how game engines work. But what does that actually mean? Well, I'm going to explain. It wasn't that long ago that game engines were considered primitive by rendering standards. In fact, with all the hype around ray tracing, it makes sense why some gamers think that ray tracing is a new technology, and why Unreal Engine 4 and 5 have seen recent use in movies and TV shows. The reality is that ray tracing, as we understand it in computer graphics, has been around since the 1960s, and in modern productions is the gold standard for CGI, with various improvements being added to the method throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And it's actually not new to games either. In fact, ray tracing has technically been a part of games since at least the 90s and became commonplace in the early 2000s when it was used to create high-fidelity lighting, but this couldn't run in real time, so developers would bake or pre-render the lighting data so that it could be stored in a file and loaded when the game started or the level was loaded. This is why games like Max Payne and Half-Life 2 appear to have a higher level of fidelity despite being significantly older. But this lighting was typically static and did not change without loading a different level with different pre-rendered lighting. Modern game projects, however, are increasingly falling into the open world category, and as a result, dynamic night and day cycles are becoming more commonplace. This means that real-time lighting has become the go-to solution, with some developers looking towards hybrid systems that let them smoothly blend between baked lighting for the different times of day. Regardless of the methodology, dynamic lighting on a large open world is really hard to do, and there will always be areas where lighting just seems off, or in the worst case, seems outright terrible. Regardless of how it looks, dynamic real-time lighting can be very expensive if not managed properly, which requires an extensive process that I am not prepared to explain at this time. However, the mismanagement of dynamic lighting is just one facet of the problem. As a Unity game dev myself, I've been especially baffled by the number of poorly performing games made in Unreal Engine, which is typically associated with better visuals and performance, and I've become convinced that it boils down to 2 key areas. The first area of trouble is Blueprint. While Epic themselves have shown that Blueprint can run as fast as native C++, one thing I've noticed is a number of developers who simply do not know how to use Blueprint to their advantage, and consistently make the same mistake of ticking every blueprint every frame. In Unity, this is the equivalent of putting everything you do in the update function of a C# script, or worse, putting it in the fixed update function, which runs multiple times a frame. One of the most important things to remember about game engines is that they are constantly running, not just in terms of rendering what is on the screen, but also in terms of the game logic running under the hood. So it is important to not run calculations or ticks every frame unless you absolutely have to. In Unity, the standard is to use events and triggers so that you only execute game logic when it absolutely needs to run. The second area of trouble is artwork. While experienced developers eventually learn the importance of optimizing artwork, especially those working in Unity, lots of younger developers have a habit of loading up a scene with artwork and paying little to no attention to things like draw calls, overdraw, and polycount. There are methods and tools for addressing issues related to these things, but the knowledge on how and when to employ them seems to have been lost. Because while older developers will declare the value of learning old-school optimization techniques and tools, Epic Games has decided to take a slightly different approach. Nanite is the best example of Epic's philosophy. Rather than teaching young developers how to make level of detail meshes and why they are important, Epic has created Nanite to address the issue of polycount management. It does this by taking a very high poly mesh and automatically adjusting the number of polys in the mesh with respect to how much pixel space the mesh takes up on screen. This is both a solution and a problem. While Nanite frees artists and developers from the work of manually creating level of detail meshes, it is inherently dependent upon screen space, which means the higher your screen resolution, the more pixels Nanite has to calculate for. So if you ever find yourself wondering why your monster gaming rig is struggling to run an Unreal Engine game at 4K resolution, Nanite is probably to blame. While the prospect of Nanite seems awesome, and the developers at Epic are actively working to make it the best solution moving forward, I'm still a fan of good old-fashioned level of detail meshes, or LODs, and imposters, especially when it comes to Unity. But Epic's philosophy of solving issues in this manner doesn't stop there. It's no secret that Unreal Engine is far more efficient at rendering than Unity. From lighting to materials to textures, Unreal is a monster when it comes to rendering and always has been. I still remember to this day seeing the Unreal Tournament 3 2005 tech demo on TV and geeking out about it. However, no matter how efficient you make the renderer, there is no getting around the infamous draw call. A draw call is what happens when the graphics processing unit asks for an asset, like a mesh or a texture, to render onto the screen. The weight of a draw call can vary depending upon what the asset is and how much memory it takes up. While there have been improvements over the years, the math is still the same. More draw calls means less performance. So when the younger game devs are pulling down assets from the asset store and just throwing them into a scene without thinking about the draw calls, the performance typically tanks. However, there is a solution to this, and it is one that can be implemented either manually at the start of production, or with advanced and sometimes expensive technology at the end of production. One such piece of technology I can think of is called Simplygon. Another is OneBatch. While Simplygon will cost you an arm and a leg, OneBatch is available for Unity via the Asset Store. To my understanding, Unreal has some basic built-in tools for this, but there are also robust solutions available on Fab. Regardless of the tools, the process is called texture amalgamation, sometimes also called texture atlas packing. Texture amalgamation is the process of combining textures and materials into a single massive texture atlas. This is typically used for environment assets, but can be used for almost anything. To give you an example of the effect this has on draw calls, we'll do some simple math. Let's say you have 32 materials in your game. Each material has one color map, one normal map, and one lighting map, which these days includes information for metallic roughness and occlusion. In Unreal, this is sometimes called the ORM map. In Unity's high-definition render pipeline, this is called the mask map. If we multiply 32 by 3, we get 96 textures. Each texture requires a draw call, so that's 96 draw calls. And if each texture is a 4K texture map, we're looking at about 23 megabytes per texture. That's about 2,208 megabytes of data being called every frame. If we amalgamate those textures, we can at least reduce the draw calls from 96 to 3. By amalgamating those textures into a single atlas, we're not just reducing the total number of draw calls, we can also reduce the total amount of memory those textures take up, and how that memory is allocated, as textures in an atlas can be compressed and stored more efficiently than numerous individual textures. Additionally, there is less of a likelihood that the engine will have to load and unload multiple textures, and instead load a single texture and keep it in memory, sometimes until after the game is shut down. The Key takeaway here is that fewer draw calls typically means better performance, but it doesn't end there. The last point I want to bring up is that of overdraw. Some of you may remember a fancy video from the Horizon Zero Dawn developers showing off tech where the terrain was being loaded and unloaded depending upon where the camera was looking. Unless the engine works differently, there really isn't any loading or unloading going on. Rather, the engine is selecting only those things in view of the camera to render. Anything that the camera does not have direct line of sight to is not rendered. This method is called occlusion culling. Occlusion culling is important because it stops the engine from doing overdraw on things the camera can't see. This isn't just about poly count though. Everything from object count to lights and shadows is affected by this. In Unity, it is a simple setup to get it working, and you can reduce your render time significantly. In Unreal, there is a similar solution, but I've never used it, so you'll have to explore that one for yourselves. And there you have it. Unreal Engine isn't killing games. Rather, it is a perfect storm of decisions on the part of Epic Games combined with the aspirations of young developers, some who are only just now getting their feet wet with game engines. And when it comes to 3D artists, they probably cut their teeth with Maya, Blender, ZBrush, or 3D Studio Max, where frames per second is not relevant, and render times are often used as an excuse to take a break from the computer. Regardless of who is to blame the most, the reality we are experiencing is one in which it is now easier than ever before to make games that look absolutely gorgeous and run like garbage.